Welcome, everybody. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. Very happy today to be with you for the virtual reading group, where we're really just beginning. It's the second session on the life of the mind, Hannah Arendt's last unfinished work. We read the introduction last week, and we're starting book one today. Before I start, and I'm going to get into a little bit of the structure of the book, I just want to make an announcement and an acknowledgement. I've been doing this reading group for about almost, I think, 10, 12, I don't even know, I think almost 12 years. Um, and one of the very first people to join the reading group was someone named Bob Meyerson, who I'm sure many of you know. He's been one of the more reliable and vocal and engaged members of our reading group over the last 12 years. Uh, Bob died this week. I just heard from his daughter, and uh, uh, we will miss him both as a friend. He's come to some of the RN conferences. He was, I mean, many ways, Bob was someone who did his PhD at and wrote her PhD on Hannah Arendt and interviewed Hannah Arendt for his PhD. He's one of those people who still had a connection to her herself, but life works in mysterious ways, and he ended up a banker and owned a series of banks in the Midwest, where I think um, he gave real meaning to the idea of a local ethical banker who supported his community and his people, and did so in a way that we should all be proud of. Anyway, we miss him. He was one of our. I mean, one of the things I loved about Bob is he loved Hannah Arendt, but he was deeply skeptical of Hannah Arendt, and he was one of the people who asked, I think, some of the more um, sometimes critical questions in this group, and I always appreciated that. So someone maybe will take on his role at some point. Um, but we will all miss him. It's been a tough year losing first Jerry Cohn, and now Bob Meyerson. But I just wanted to acknowledge him as one of the sort of longest tenured and more active members of our group over the last over a decade. Okay, back to Hannah Arendt's The Life of the Mind. The Life of the Mind was supposed to be um, a book in three parts: thinking, willing, and judging. Uh, the judging book was never written. We are reading Thinking and Willing, which were both drafted. Um, the Thinking book itself begins with an introduction, which we read and discussed last week, and then has um, four chapters. Each chapter has a number of sections or subchapters, and this is one of those things that it's sometimes hard to know what we're talking about. So chapter one, which we're starting today as appearance, has 8 chapters or sections. I call them chapters. It's going to get a little confusing, but I just wanted to make a note of this structure. So chapter one is appearance. Chapter two is mental activities in the world of appearances. Chapter three is what makes us think. And chapter four is where are we when we think? And those will be the 4 main chapters of Thinking, the first book of the life of the mind. So today we are starting chapter one on appearance. Just a quick recap, because I think it's important. Um, we said last week that Arendt says she's writing this book, which is a different kind of book for her, insofar as she's taking on the life of the mind, a more philosophical approach, right? Her early work really was about the life of the vita activa, the life of action, um, set against the life of contemplation. And she says, okay, why should someone like me who doesn't style themselves a philosopher, why should we write a book about thinking and the life of the mind when we really care about action? And she gives two reasons. One has to do with how actually thinking can be active. Um, and the second is that in in the wake of her uh, coverage of the Eichmann trial, the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem, she framed the question for herself of, well, if Eichmann's um, evil was not monstrosity but banality, she asked, could the activity of thinking as such, the habit of examining, whatever comes to pass, um, could this stopping and thinking as an activity be among the conditions that make human beings abstain from evil doing or even condition human beings against evil doing? Um, and so thinking becomes an important worldly activity. Can thinking actually impact the world? Does it have political or worldly importance? Um, that's the first, I think, main point of the introduction. The second is that if thinking is going to have this worldly importance, we have to understand that thinking is not about truth, right? Um, it is about meaning. So she says the need of reason is inspired by the quest is not inspired. I'm sorry, I'll say it again. The need of reason is not inspired by the quest for truth, but by the quest for meaning, and truth and meaning are not the same. Um, she says it again at the end on page 404. And I'm sorry, this is another formulation in another text where she says, meaning is an elusive word, much more elusive even than the word truth. I introduce it into our discussion in the same intent I introduce distinction between knowing and thinking. And so, um, if thinking is going to potentially block the doing of evil, we have to understand thinking as about meaning, and not about truth. Okay, and this leads to the first of four chapters or sections of this book on thinking, and the first one is called appearance. Um, appearance, obviously, for those of you, I shouldn't say obviously, appearance, for those of you who studied philosophy, will know that appearance usually has a bad name in philosophy. Um, from Plato's time, and even before Plato, and Parmenides' time as well, the pre-Socratics, up to the present, philosophy has generally thought that it seeks being, um, what is permanent and beyond the apparent or the sensible. The general idea is that what we see is fleeting. People will die, but what is the essence of a person that lasts eternally? Um, a flower will grow and die, but what is a flower? We seek the what Plato called the world of ideas, the eternal, the supersensible. Um, and so the apparent world is seen as a world that is fleeting and less real than the ideal world because it doesn't last. Um, and philosophy has traditionally demeaned appearance versus being. Um, and yet Arendt is here going to some extent, invert that hierarchy or at least deny the distinction. She begins with an epigraph by her friend, sort of friend, W.H. Auden, who asks, does God ever judge us by appearances? I suspect that he does, which is simply a way of saying that appearances, while they're often, we all say don't judge a book by a cover, right? Um, you know, Again, to say that appearances are not what's important. What's important are what underlies the appearance, the truth behind it. And yet, God probably does judge us sometimes by our appearances. It's not just the intent behind it. It's also what you do. Um, so she begins with section one or chapter one, however we're going to use it. I'm going to use chapter one just because it's hard for me to always say section. But it's called The World's Phenomenal Nature. And she begins by saying the world men are born into contains many things, right? Natural and artificial, living and dead, transient and sempiternal, all of which have in common that they appear and hence are meant to be seen, heard, touched, tasted, smelled, to be perceived by sentient creatures endowed with the appropriate sense organs. We all appear. We all appear into a world that already exists, right? So if you're someone who reads some Heidegger or phenomenology, we're all thrown into a world that already exists and contains many things. And all the things in the world appear. They're meant to be seen and heard and touched and tasted and smelled. Um, what that means is that to be, to exist, and to appear coincide, right? Um, Nothing or nobody exists without someone who sees or hears them, without a spectator. Um, this is, of course, the answer to the question that every introductory philosophy professor asks their students, right? Which is if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's around to hear it or see it, does it make a sound? And Arendt's answer, which was also Heidegger's answer, is no, it does not. Um, because if the tree falls and there's no one there, it doesn't appear. And without appearing, it doesn't exist. Sound, sense, is actually a human quality. It's not an objective quality. And so sound as a human quality means that if there's no human to hear it, there's no sound. It's an extraordinarily profound philosophical insight. I mean, she takes this in large degree from Heidegger, um, but it is she's making of it something different from Heidegger because for Arendt it has a political implication in a way that it doesn't for Heidegger, which is that since nothing exists in the singular, everything that exists must appear. And since it must appear, it must be seen or heard or touched or tasted or smelled by others, which means that there is a necessary plurality to the human world. There is no sovereign, isolated subject. And so, against sort of the philosophical tradition, including Descartes, right, who says, cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am, and therefore says that simply I, individual alone, Rene Descartes, thinking I am. And Arendt says, no, self consciousness doesn't guarantee your existence because you have to appear to someone else. Plurality, as she concludes here in this at the end of the first paragraph of this section, plurality is the law of the earth. And this is one of her, of course, core ideas that's very central to the human condition and throughout all of her work. So we appear. Appearing is being. We will also disappear. We are born and we will die. And there are actors and there are spectators, and we need both. And this is something that is constant through her work, right? So if you want to think of sort of examples of actors and spectators that she discusses and uses as models throughout her work, Pericles or Achilles are actors, right? They're people who act, and what she says of actors is they don't control their story. They act into the world, and then spectators see them, hear them, listen to them, and respond to them and tell us stories about them. And the spectators, more than the actors, control who the actors are, and tell their story. Uh, and so you need both sides at all times. Um, she adds something here which is new to her work, which is that she's not talking only about humans, right? Appearances, she says, are are are, are sensed, and as sensed, there's an infinite variety of beings who sense, both human and non-human. So a beetle sees with beetle eyes and perceives the world differently than humans. A dog smells with a nose that obviously is much more sensitive than a human nose. Um, and all living beings, right? Um, you know, appear and also need uh, to appear for others and have things appear for them. Um, but living beings, she says, are not mere appearances. Stones are mere appearances, or earth. But living beings both appear to others, but also perceive the world. Um, and all living beings not only appear and perceive, but here's one of the new ideas she introduces: they have an urge to self display. Now, she actually has talked about this in another sense before in her book On Revolution, where she attributes this idea to John Adams, uh, who says that um, all human beings have a desire to be seen and heard, to display themselves, um, and there's a desire to speak and act in public. Um, and so we seek to be seen, we seek to be heard, on and like an actor on a stage, we seek to be heard in a world, um and in so doing, um we seek to be seen, we see other people, and the world always appears, it seems, in a way, to me. um every appearance is perceived differently by a plurality of spectators, and thus all appearance is a kind of seeming, what she calls dokemoi, from the Greek, the way it seems to me. Um, this is why, for politics, there is no truth in politics, because in a political world, there are a huge number of different perspectives in which things are seen and how they appear. There is, she says, not just it's not just that appearance and being are sort of co-equal, right? It's not that all being and appearance coincide. In fact, she wants to go further and say there's actually a primacy of appearance for all living creatures who who perceive the world in this way in which the world seems to me. Because uh, you know, we only can think through perception. She'll talk more about this, I think, in chapters like 11, 12, and 13, where she talks about metaphors. But we'll get there. But for now, the point is that thinking, which seems to not be based in appearance, right? A withdrawal from the world. When we think, we can't see thinking, it's invisible, it doesn't appear. Um, and yet, all thinking, as though it withdraws from the world, um, it somehow, she says, bends back towards the self. Um, this thinking, which is a human activity, the most human activity, Uh, she says, how does it appear? Does it appear? Um, why does this matter? Well, I mean, if we're interested in thinking, how does thinking appear? How do we see thinking? How do we know about thinking? Um, she says on page 30 in the critical edition or 23 in the in the older edition, I can flee appearance only into appearance. Right? So if I flee the apparent world into the true world, into the world of being, into the world of ideas, um, I still am stuck in appearance. I can't think outside of language. And I can't think outside of appearances. Um, this is going to be what she calls the metaphorical foundation of thought. All language has a metaphorical basis for her. Um, and so this is going to come up again. But the basic problem here is we're interested in thinking. Why? Go back to the basics. We want to know if thinking can actually prevent evil. Um, okay. Well, how do we think about thinking? Well, the problem is that thinking seems not to appear, seems to be invisible. Um, uh, Thinking is invisible and soundless, and yet, um, can it be at home in the world? Can we actually think about thinking? And how do we appear as thinking beings? Beings who are at once of the world and appear to others, and yet also seem to be withdrawn from the world. Um, and that's the question she wants to ask. In chapter 2, called True Being and Mere Appearance, the Two World Theory, she's talking about uh, the way both philosophy and science, which she thinks here are similar, um, uh, are predicated on what she calls uh, the two world theory. The two world theory is very basic. I've already intimated it. It's that uh, there is the world of appearing and the world of being, the world of effects and the world of causes, the world of bodies and the world of mind, and they don't interact, right? So if you think of it at its most uh, in its strictest form, it's sort of the world of Cartesian dualism, right? That there's pure mind and there's pure body, and they don't interact. And Descartes says, well, then how can there be any connection between what we think and what we do? And he calls it the Deus ex machina, the God in the machine that somehow connects our thoughts to our bodies. Um, uh, she says this is, of course, a metaphysical fallacy that separates thinking and, I mean, being and appearing, cause and effect, idea and reality. And yet, and this is going to be one of the common moves throughout this text, this metaphysical fallacy has, she says, a basis in real experience. And here, the first basis is that appearance conceals. There's no doubt about that. All of us, in the way we appear, you know, whether we're wearing clothes, whether we're wearing makeup, whether we've brushed our hair, but even if we're stark naked, the way we appear always conceals something else, conceals something. All appearance is a kind of illusion. She uses a play on German words here. All shine ist Erscheinung. All appearance shine, but shining appearance in the sense of a pretty appearance is a kind of illusion and a Erscheinung. Um, and and so the turn away from appearance to truth, from appearance to being, from effect to cause, is looking for something that is not apparent, that is true without appearance. And yet, insofar as you're looking for something, when you see God or you see truth or you see the ideas of Plato's truth, it's somehow revealed to you in the mind's eye. It's still a seeing, it's still an appearing. And even in science, right? When we cut open a body to see what's inside of it, we still are seeing things inside the surface. And so on page 33 in the critical edition and page 30 in the original edition, she writes, no man can live among causes or give full account in normal human language of a being whose truth can be scientifically demonstrated in the laboratory, right? We can't live amongst pure being, pure mind, pure causes. We live in a world of appearances. That's the point. And so if we want to understand thinking, we can't simply say thinking is withdrawal or thinking is invisible. We're going to have to somehow um, uh, cross over and say, how does thinking appear in the world? Um, and that's the problem. She says in the same paragraph at the end of this second section, she says, being once made manifest. So once you try and make manifest or make clear being as opposed to appearance, well, of course, once you make it manifest, it appears. But being once made manifest overrules appearances, right? It's above appearances, except, of course, that nobody has yet succeeded in living in a world that does not manifest itself of its own accord. You can't live in a world without appearance. And so being itself has a kind of appearance to it. And so she's breaking down this fallacy, and yet she's also saying that there is a truth to the fallacy, an experiential truth. And yet we have to live in that mixture. All right, chapter 3 is where things start to get really interesting, right? This is in many ways, the first two chapters are sort of laying out some basic ground of the history of philosophy and being and appearance, and her saying, okay, we're going to focus on appearance. But chapter 3 is where things get a little difficult, and where she really starts to um, develop her argument. It's called the reversal of a metaphysical hierarchy, the value of the surface, right? To what extent is the surface appearance valuable? Remember, Auden says, does God judge us by appearance? Yeah, I think he probably does. Well, should he? Shouldn't he shouldn't he judge us or she judge us by what's inside of us, by a truth inside of us? And Arendt is here going to start to defend the surface, the apparent. Um, she begins and says, neither the philosopher nor the scientist can escape the common sense world. We live in a common sense world. We live in a world of appearances. Um, and in that world of common sense and appearances, there's illusion and error. And what a scientist and a philosopher both try and do is eliminate error by reaching beyond appearance and beyond illusion to some truth, some being, some cause, some first mover. But there's no shine without Erscheinung. There's no appearance without deception. And so modern science is constantly seeking the truth behind the Erscheinung, but it's highly dubious, she says on page 30 or 33. She's highly dubious that we'll ever get behind appearances because the scientist belongs to a world of appearances and they can only think in appearances. And so she says, in science, there's an unremovable doubt inherent in the search for being or truth or the first cause. And she here brings up a topic which I have to say has been underthought in Arendt scholarship, um, which is her suspicion of the idea of progress. It's an idea that is constant in her work, but she never writes in a full book on it. But it's one of those things that if anyone's ever looking for an interesting topic to write on Arendt, this is one I would suggest. Um, uh, Progress, right, is a dogma, is an ideology. She really does think it's an ideology, and it's a scientific ideology. Um, it says that we always expect progress to move further and further ahead, but we can never get there because progress is constantly progressive. There's no end point. Um, and so there's always progress, but you never get to any um uh final end of it, which means that progress always has to in some sense reject the present. It's the opposite of amor mundi. Um, and and in that sense, uh, progress always has to develop, at least scientific ideas of progress, always has to develop a theory that will show why the current world is inadequate and will lead to a better world. And this is the inherent predicament, right, that she is talking about uh, in science. This is especially true in the life sciences of biology and medicine um, and psychology, because in these sciences, she says, um, the way we the way we think about progress is functional. Um, there's a functional hypothesis that all things that appear, all appearances, have a hidden function. So a dolphin is shaped the way it does so that it can jump and swim fast and sort of glide through the water. And the colors of a peacock are there to attract a mate. They have a function. And she says this leads us to, in a sense, dismiss the beauty of the dolphin or the beauty of the peacock and just say it's a functional, uh, um, you know, uh, um, evolutionary trait. Um, the great advantage of functionalism, right, is that it makes the world fit a theory, Darwinism, or utilitarianism. And if we have a theory that makes the world understandable and explainable, um, then the world makes sense to us and we feel satisfied or happy. Um, uh, that's what she says that on in the critical edition on page 34. Um, but she says there's a real danger in this functionalism, this functionalist hypothesis. And to articulate this danger, she turns to a Swiss biologist and zoologist named Adolf Portmann. I mean, not biologist, a botanist and zoologist named Adolf Portmann. He wrote a number of books in the 1930s and 40s. Uh, those dates are important, obviously, for reasons that I think you'll all appreciate. It's the rise of Nazism and during the Holocaust. Um, and Portman, again, remember Arendt's basic thesis about totalitarianism, which is that it is a pseudoscientific ideology, right? That Nazi ideology is a pseudoscientific um, appropriation of Darwinism as social Darwinism, which suggests that there are some races that are more fit than others, and that the world will lead to it will move in the progression of more fit, better races, or in Stalinism, right? That there are certain classes that will rule and should rule the earth, and that there will be a historical movement towards the rule of the proletariat and the elimination of the bourgeoisie. These theoretical justifications for mass murder, right, which Arendt sees as at the core of the origins of totalitarianism, um, are, uh, are attempts to say that there are theories um, that that will lead to um, uh, some groups being privileged over and needing the extermination or elimination of other groups. Um, Portman uh, begins with his book, The Beauty of Butterflies, in 1936, in wonder at the butterflies, at how many hundreds of thousands and millions of different species of butterfly there are. And Now, functionalism would say that all those colors and all those different species of butterfly are there for a reason, whether it's sexual attraction or avoiding predators or whatever it is. What's the function? But he moves beyond that. He says, well, there's also thousands of snails and trees and amazing variations of wild carrots, right? And all these functions, and if you want to sort of reduce them to functionalism, right? The question is, well, okay, you could do that. You could say, they're there for sexual reproduction or for hiding from predators or whatever. But what he says is all this variety can't be functional. There can't be a function for every different color of carrot or butterfly. And so Portman says that functionalism is actually a theory, right? It's an ideology that says that the whole world follows laws, that order and master the world, right? He writes this in the 1940s. So you have to think about what's going on. He says, yes, science has its benefits in that in ordering the world, we can control the world and we can make the world serve our purposes and our functions. But it's also a human exertion of power over material things and over the human and animal worlds. And in a book he writes called Animal Forms, he says, quote, by aiming all the time at discovering the laws of nature, functionalism completely overlooks that in doing this, one of the most important general laws has been utterly forgotten. One of the most important universal phenomena of all, the constant production in the course of the Earth's history of new organic life. It's an extraordinary statement. In constantly looking for functions and assuming that everything has a function, we forget another law, he says, which is the infinite variety of new organic appearances and life forms, which he says exceed any function. And so he says the search for laws of nature turn us away from multiplicity and plurality and organic life. They provide the banisters to make true, simple, functional claims about the world. Simplifications, right? That's what theories do. And the danger in functionalism is that we forget the values of the things themselves, right? So go back to the origins of totalitarianism. The danger is we forget that each different plural group in the world, each individual has its value in itself. And so birds' feathers do not just keep the bird warm, Portman says, but the feathers have a kind of worth and meaning in themselves, simply in their appearance, in the surface. This is an extraordinary inversion of most of modern science, insofar as science is largely functionalist. At least the life sciences are largely functionalist. And Arendt says that Portman has two facts to support his thesis. One is the incredible variety of appearances, which just is beyond function, suggests that all appearance cannot simply be reduced to function. And the second is that the innate impulse of all things to present themselves, Darstellung, to set themselves before us, to self-display themselves, suggests that all living things are not just merely functional, but actually want to be seen, want to be heard, want to make their presence felt, want to tell their story, want to be meaningful, right? That brings you back to the overarching theme of the book, right? That thinking is about the quest for meaning, not about the quest for truth. For Arendt, action in politics is not functional, right? When we act in politics, it's not about achieving some end. It's about starting something new which we can't control, a story that will be controlled by the actors and the spectators in their interactions on the surface. And so, in the search for meaning and not truth, she's saying we have to look beyond function, look beyond natural laws, and instead look to variety, not to the not to the cause, the hidden cause, but to the effects, not to being, but to appearing. Um, if thinking is to ward off evil, right? This is the overarching question of the book. Well, how does thinking appear? And she wants to say it's going to appear to the extent it appears, um, not in scientific theories, not in truth, not in laws. Um, it's going to appear in, um, well, I'm gonna give you a bit of a preview of what's coming, right? But it's going to appear in puzzlement, moments when we are confused, where we question the laws, when we question the certainties, when we stop and think, uh, and that's and so the infinite variety of appearance and of color and of the world the way it comes to see us frustrates all scientific theoretical attempts to simplify the world. And that's how thinking is going to appear in some sense. And the model for that thinking is going to be Socrates, who we will be spending a lot of time with as we read further into this book. All right, but I'll stop there for today. Um, uh, and hopefully we can have a conversation going. I do admit that this is a more philosophical text than a lot of our other Arendtian texts, and yet I hope I've made clear that there is a serious political um and ethical drive going on in this text, and I hope it's one that is compelling. You can engage in the chat as always. Please be respectful, and of course, you can raise your hands. I don't see hands up, which suggests that maybe this was clear to all of you, or just not that exciting. We'll see. I find this to be a very exciting text, but it may be a bit abstract. We'll see. Jason.
Yeah, Roger, one of the things that rung true for me a little bit this time was the notion of how we present ourselves, even particularly psychologically, as a representation of the subconscious that we're protecting. And that kind of defines our stratagems that we indulge in. And even though Arendt wasn't really going in that direction, she was keeping it biologic. I really did appreciate that there seemed to be a symmetry there.
Um, can you say that again? Say that in another way, Jason? I'm not sure I fully understood it.
Well, we have the physical appearing of how we are um, manifesting with our bilateral symmetry, with our, you know, long hairlines or whatever. Yeah, everything that we use to, what we're, as a species. But then, is there even a possible argument for in the way that we present ourselves to one another, sociologically, is an appearance that is in fact a masking of what is beneath, of past traumas or past joys, and that maybe this isn't even just biology or zoology.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's right. There's, I mean, if you're going to um see value in the surface in the appearance, it's not just biology, right? The color of our skin or the color of our eyes or the color of our hair, or the shape of our bodies. Um, it's also how people appear in the sense of their mood, and there's what we might call the Stimmung, the mood, or the uh um or their affect. Are they optimistic or positive, etc. And all of these ways that people appear in public, um she's going to say yes, are meaningful. um and not just mere appearances. I think many people say, oh, you know well, you're having a bad day, it's a mood, but it's not who you are. Okay, it's true. And yet it also matters, and moods matter. um Passions matter. We'll get into that later in this chapter, the importance of passions as opposed to simply logical or thoughts. And so these will become important elements of the inquiry into appearances. The question, though, right, is how does thinking appear? Um, and and the reason she's asking about appearances is that it does seem that thinking doesn't appear. Um, and if that's the case, then maybe it doesn't have any impact in the world. And so part of what she wants to do is articulate a way in which there is a way in which thinking appears in the world, um, and and is not simply, even though it is in essence invisible and based in withdrawal from the world. Uh,
Fantastic.
Julie, Julie, you have to unmute.
Thank you. Is it good now? Okay. One of the things that I was interested in was the a comment came up during the chat that cited a piece of pottery as being both functional and having sort of display within its appearance. And I was wondering if you could comment on the when you think about art and you think about fine arts, and the fact that thinking goes into the making of something which is primarily an appearance, and that in turn sort of gives a concreteness to the thinking that went behind that particular appearance. In other words, it would be sort of an assertion of visual knowledge.
Right. So, I mean, there's two parts to that. One is not just in art, but in nature, right? There are plenty of things that are both um appearance and also functional, right? The thumb is apparent but also quite functional. Um, just to give one classic example, uh, the shape of the dolphin, as I mentioned before, or a bird's feathers. Um, all of those things are both appearing and yet also have a hidden function, or a hidden but non-hidden function, because it also appears. Um, uh, Art, as she writes, is sort of the epitome of what she calls work. Um, Something that is done not to keep us alive, like making bread, but is designed to um, contribute to the human world, to last and outlast us, and in that sense, build a world that we begin to share. Right, the classic works of art uh, are works that we all know, we can talk about, we see, and become part of our common world. And so, um, in that sense, art are uh, things that preserve and last and break up the sort of arc of living and dying, because they preserve a common world through history. Um, uh, Insofar as they are products of thought, art, usually can last because it is unexpected when it appears, right? The works of art, she thinks that last and that are great works of art are works of art that were not predictable, that didn't come from some theory, but that come from some uh, new creativity, human spontaneity, out of nowhere. Um, and in that sense, they are a kind of new appearance that was untheorizable until after it appears, and then in you can in hindsight say, oh, here's how it developed out of the last stage, but you would never have had a theory beforehand of where it was going. Um, and so for her, art is an example of that kind of um, uh, uh, apparent, thoughtful, uh, um, overabundance um, that 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 incapacitates or shows the limits of theory. Um, and that is the importance of art for her, um, in many ways. Is that I'm not sure if I fully answered your question, Julie, but maybe I did or maybe I didn't. I'll let you
Thank,
follow up on that if you want to.
yeah, thank you very much. And I have read the work on what she says about art is related to work.
Yeah.
So that made sense in that context as well. Thank you.
Okay, great. Hannah. Hannah, you're muted. You're gonna have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, very sorry. I had asked in the chat, just because something has a function, does it not does it mean that necessarily that it's reduced? It's hard for me to get beyond Darwin here in terms of species. Excuse me. I'm not quite sure, like, certainly with art, you can see that it's far more than functional. But I don't know about, like, it's hard for me to think that, like, species, their design doesn't have a function.
Yeah.
So it's really hard for me to see that.
I think you're speaking for most of us, and I appreciate your clarity and honesty on that because I think most of us are functionalists. Um, we have been raised in a scientific functionalist world where we're taught that appearances are simply have causes that are, that underlie them, and that I think it's one of the things you teach your kids when they're 3 and 4, right? Look at the peacock's feathers. Aren't they pretty? But they have a cause, they have a reason. They're there for attracting a mate, or listen to the beautiful bird song. Ah, but it has a reason. It's there for warning or for
Even
attract.
things you can't see, even things you can't see, like their internal workings that you can't see, even things that aren't appearances, you believe they're there, because they have a purpose.
That's right. And so, whether you're religious and you believe it's all part of God's scheme, or whether you're philosophical and you think it's part of, a master philosophical God
You're
scheme,
Darwinian.
or whether you're a scientist or a Darwinian and you think it's natural selection or historical dialectical materialism, or simply mere functionalism or mechanistic theory, um we've all been brainwashed, Arendt would say. I mean, she doesn't use that word, but I'll use a word that she would use. We've all been um uh propagandized by the ideology of scientism. And insofar as we have uh inherited and inculcated and internalized uh, a privileging of the theory over the appearance. And what that means is that we don't actually attend to the wonder
That's
of.
not true, though. because I find everything incredibly wonderful at the same time. I
Okay.
think they can coexist, which is why I said, does the function necessarily mean it's being reduced? And I don't necessarily think it is.
So, I mean, again, I am not going to, um,
But, besides that, because
let me just answer. I'm
yeah,
not going to disagree with you in the sense that I'm not going to say that you don't appreciate it, because how could I know? And I think all of us, we say stop and smell the roses,
right,
right?
right,
And things like that. Um, but I think what Arendt is saying
yeah,
is that, um, we may say stop and smell the roses, and we do appreciate the beauty. Um, but there is a deep internalization of a scientism which tells us that while it's beautiful and it's this, in the end, these are secondary. What's primary is the purpose, is the function.
okay,
Um, and most of us, um, especially those of us who are more educated and more indoctrinated in scientism, will stop and smell the roses. But if the roses, get in the way of something, we'll cut them, we'll uproot the bush and put something else there. Um, and we'll hear the birds, but if the birds are, getting in the way of airplanes landing, we'll move the birds. Um, and so what she's saying is that the infinite variety, we can sometimes appear, it sometimes, appeals to us, but in the end, um, we have largely internalized a theory in which that variety is secondary of importance.
oh, well, the other question I just wanted to ask, and I just wanted to say, and you don't have to answer it, but I'm completely not grasping, even remotely, why she's asking the question of how does thinking appear. So I'm assuming it's because I'm not very knowledgeable in philosophy and that it'll come. But right now, I don't know why she's even asking the question of how will thinking appear.
Mhm.
But is that okay?
Well, okay, no, I think it's an important question. I'm glad you asked it. Um, the book is on the life of the mind, right? And we want to understand how the mind works. Uh, and at the core of that is thinking to some degree, because thinking, she's going to say, plays a role in potentially preventing or at least deterring evil. Um, but if thinking doesn't appear in the world, is not part of the common world, and our world is a world of appearances, then thinking doesn't seem to have any impact. If thinking is just what happens, I don't know, when someone climbs up on a mountain and goes into a cave and disappears for 10 years, how is it going to actually impact the world? Um, where is thinking in the world? And that's what she's asking. Um, and she's saying it's a problem because all of our historical great thinkers, who, to the extent they think about thinking, evacuate thinking from the world, say it has nothing to do with the world. I mean, Descartes is the most extreme. He says thinking and the world have nothing in common. You can't even connect them. But even Plato says thinking, moves us beyond the world. Um, and and so what she's
Yeah, I
saying,
don't understand that. I would say thinking drives the world.
well, to the extent thinking drives the world, uh, it's because what thinking then does is order the world, and that's where this chapter comes in. And to the extent thinking ordered those world, it can master the world. At which point, thinking is um, at odds with the plurality of the world, and it will seek to simplify and unify and totalize the world. That's her fear.
Oh,
Um, and so uh, she's interested in the question of whether you can imagine and conceive thinking that is worldly, not simply otherworldly, not simply a masterful thinking, right? Not a scientific thinking, not a thinking that is a hierarchical thinking that puts being above appearing, that puts causes above effects. And that's what she's looking for, is a worldly thinking. And the question is, since all other approaches to thinking by philosophers and scientists have evacuated thinking from the world and made it theoretical, made it tyrannical, is there a non-tyrannical way of thinking?
Okay, thank
That's
you.
what she's after.
Thank you so much.
Gilbert,
Yes, sir.
welcome.
First of all, thank you very much. First of all, please receive my greetings.
You're received. Thank you.
Welcome. Then please, I have 2 points. One is a comment which I would like to address to you. And the second is a question which I would like to address to Joyce Muller based on what she wrote in the chat section.
Okay. I don't know. Is Joyce
Please.
still here?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay. Go ahead.
Please,
Go ahead.
at
Go ahead.
the beginning, you let us about the sad news of the person who has passed on. In this context, for me, it is like we have lost a library of wisdom. As they say that when an elder man passes, it is like a library of wisdom is lost. A library of wisdom has burned down. In this context, please, could you please ask some of us right now to spend that second in the context of acknowledging his legacy and also his value in this group? Thank you. This is for you, sir. Then my question towards Joyce Muller. Joyce Muller has written that because of appearance conceals and reveals, and then nature loves to hide. I would like to ask you, Joyce, could you please elaborate on how nature loves to hide? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gilbert.
You are most welcome.
Joyce, so first of all, I know some of you know Bob. He's been very active also in the dialogue groups. I don't know, Susan, if you want to say anything. But you know, if people do want to say anything about Bob, I think it's totally beautiful and fair of Gilbert to ask if people want to raise their hand and acknowledge him as well, from what I said. But Joyce, are you there, and do you want to say anything about your comment? Not sure if Joyce is still here.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm sorry my camera doesn't work that well, and I'm sorry I'm not raising my hand very much, but I'm sure Roger could talk about this too. I was just teaching in my environmental ethics class yesterday, Francis Bacon, who inaugurated the scientific method, but I think Arendt references too how we began to look at nature as hiding from us, and we had to wrest her secrets from us. And nature understandably loves to hide. And why does nature love to hide? Because we might eat or kill or wear or Nature will change its colors. Arendt mentions that too. If we try to wrest her secrets from her, she may camouflage herself. And you could argue nature has good reasons for hiding, because humans, if they discover her secrets, will just continue polluting, killing, all that stuff. So did I explain that point to your satisfaction, my friend?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, what was the other point again? Sorry.
Well, the other point was is if anyone wanted to respond to acknowledge Bob Meyerson.
Okay. All right, great.
He passed
Sorry,
away.
my camera doesn't work well.
I gave an acknowledgement at the beginning, but I think it's you know, as Gilbert said, he was a library of wisdom and someone who contributed a great deal to our group. But if anyone wants to, feel free to. I know Susan has her hand up. Let me just acknowledge Susan. Let me just give you a chance to say something now, if you'd like to.
Okay, well, Bob was in one of the very first dialogue groups, and that group, I think he called them the Knaves,
Yes.
and he kept it going. And my favorite thing with him was that he would say some outrageous things, and I would take him on, and we would go back and forth. He was always open and willing to have those kinds of disagreements. So I'll miss that.
I think that's well said about him, and I think we all will. Denise.
Yes, thank you. Roger, I don't know if I will go out of the text. I think a little. I wanted you to speak something about the idea of progress coming from Hegel, his dialectics and teleology. And at the same time, Hegel has his dialectics of the desire for recognition. So I heard Hegel critically, Hegel and then Marx, of course, this idea of progress. And but in Hegel, the desire for recognition, which is important. My question is if you could make a bridge, and Arendt, when she criticizes this notion of progress of our life in contraposition to amor mundi, the love for another word in this dialectics. And I am a psychoanalyst, and I would like to say rapidly, quickly, about Lacan. And it has to do with Hegel also, because Lacan said the unconscious is on the surface. So Lacan is following this line of thought. The unconscious is in the words spoken, in the wronged words, and not behind at the bottom. So he criticizes psychoanalysis. There's no hidden unconscious. The unconscious is on the surface. This is Lacan. But even so, he kept the definitions of progress and of causes, and variety is not always contemplated in his theories and in practice, as in pragmatic psychoanalysis, for instance, which is based in Wittgenstein. The language is its use, and not so sure, not structuralism. But my question goes around Hegel in all this. If Hegel makes us fall in this fallacy of substance and cause and structures, why not? And not of variety and random development. Is it clear, Roger? Is it confused?
No, I think it's pretty clear, Denise. I appreciate it. You know, Arendt was also a critic of psychoanalysis, but again, of a particular version of psychoanalysis,
Yes, I know. I'm
which
speaking of psychoanalysis after after her.
yeah, but she was critical of psychoanalysis because of the Freudian insistence that psychoanalysis be a science.
Yeah,
Um, and what she said is that, the idea that the human psyche would be reduced
yeah,
to, to a theory or to a simplification, was she thought wrong about humanity. But that doesn't mean that psychoanalysis as a way of not as a non-scientific way of thinking about the depths of the human soul was uninteresting to her. Of course, it was, and many of her, Elizabeth Young Brule, amongst others, who was a psychoanalyst, was one of Arendt's friends and eventual biographer. So I think that's her criticism of psychoanalysis is limited to its scientific approach to
yeah.
the sort of inner life of humanity. On Hegel, I mean, yes, I mean, she really I mean, again, she read Hegel, she read Marx very closely. These were people who were very important to her, but she deeply rebelled against their scientism. um, Hegel's idea that somehow the dialectic would mean that the is will be the ought, and the ought is the is, and that there's a reconciliation um, of all in the world was for her an anathema, right? She also wrote a lot about reconciliation, and she believed in the importance of loving the world. But she says, and this is where she differs from Hegel, that there is a limit um, uh, to how much we can reconcile, and that there's times in the world where you just have to say, no, this is irreconcilable, and there's no way to justify what happened. And she's obviously thinking of the Holocaust and Eichmann, and you can't simply say this was good, um, and this is how it should have been because it's part of the unfolding of a world spirit. Um, and so what she thought with Hegel and Marx is that they were too committed to theory and to the idea of theoretical progress. That would mean that everything that happens for a reason towards eventual utopia, communist utopia, or the rise of absolute spirit. So that's her rejection of the fundamental scientism or progressivism of both Hegel and Marx.
I'd like it if it makes sense. You speak something about the desire for recognition of Hegel, because we see as I try to speak about Lacan, these thinkers go both way. They try to review this metaphysical way of content and substance, and the unconscious behind and in the bottom, and but at the same time he goes to this scientificism. So but Hegel has this concept, desire for recognition, and you spoke a lot about recognition in this chapter.
Um, yeah, I did. I'm not sure I have I have much to say on it. I'm just not sure I know enough to answer that question, Denise. I apologize. Um, I'll have to think about it.
Thank you.
Okay. Max.
our discussion has made me think, speaking of dogma or an ideology within scientism and functionalism, it reminded me of Wendell Berry's book, Life is a Miracle, which he subtitled An Essay Against Modern Superstition. And in that, he was responding fairly or unfairly to what he took to be E.O. Wilson's attempt to aestheticize or lend some kind of a quasi-religious significance to what was at base evolutionary biology. And Berry's point was that at the end of the day, despite those efforts, evolutionary biology remains evolutionary biology, and that Wilson's ultimate allegiance remained there. And you used the word puzzlement. And I think now it's been 25 years since I read Life is a Miracle, but my recollection is that Berry also uses that term puzzlement, sort of synonymously with the miraculous, with a sense of wonder and humility and so forth. I'm wondering if that basic orientation of puzzlement, is that sort of a point of departure for an approach to others and to life itself in this promise and forgiveness dyad, that we make promises as best we can, knowing that we're going to constantly be encountering this uncertainties, and that we ask forgiveness, and hopefully we'll give it when we fail in our promises on account of those uncertainties, and still try to maintain that sense of the miraculous or puzzlement or love of the world.
That's a wonderful question. I'm trying to think if a lot's been written about Arendt and puzzlement. Maybe someone can tell me if that's been a thematic. I've written a fair bit about her idea of thinking, as have others, and I've often used the words which she uses, stop and think. And in her, and we'll get to this again later in the text. But it's also in her text, Thinking and Moral Considerations. For her, the only time that thinking actually plays a political worldly role is when the world has, in a sense, stopped thinking and has become governed by an ideology that has made people thoughtless, and the thinker stops and thinks, and in a sense puts a wrench in the gear simply by stopping and thinking and not going along with what they're supposed to be doing. And simply by doing that, they make people at least question their commitment to that ideology. That people may just keep on going with their ideology, but they at least have to question it. I was just listening. I drove home late last night and was listening to some articles that were read to me by some artificial intelligence voice that are in the newspapers these days, and one of them was about how fewer and fewer business people and institutional leaders are questioning the current administration because they're afraid of being targeted either by Mr. Musk or President Trump or others, and that there's a desire to sort of be quiet and not speak out. Now, let me say, there's also plenty of people speaking out, but many people who have institutional responsibilities are deciding that for the good of their institutions, they don't want to speak out. That doesn't mean they're not thinking. It just means that they're making a calculation that the best way to resist is to keep their institutions strong and let them keep doing what they're doing, and not attract the ire of the powers that be. The problem of, and by the way, there was arguments made by people, similar arguments made by many people who are in the mainstream or on the right, in response to, like woke kind of thought police or things like that. People would say, I'm just not going to get into this because if I try and resist it, I'm just going to get canceled, and I'm not going to, and it's better for me just to fly under the radar. I think that in many ways, there's truth to all that, and that goes along with a kind of idea of thinking, which is a withdrawal from the world, right? That I can keep thinking and sort of pull back. But what I think is what I think is fascinating about Arendt's approach is her saying that to the extent thinking is going to matter in the world, it has to appear, and that means it has to sound and be seen in some ways, and that's an important distinction. There are I will say there's only one person that I know that has brought Arendt and Wendell Berry together, and that's Jay Barry, the wonderful Arendt scholar who founded Arendt Studies. And he actually gave a talk at the Arendt Center a few years ago on Arendt and Wendell Berry, which I believe is published in one of our journals. So you're welcome to take a look at that. But Wendell Berry's work is, I think, a great place to look for someone who celebrates the miraculousness of plurality and the land and the avoidance of the kind of theories that Arendt is talking about. So I think it's a wonderful question. Thanks
Thank you.
very much.
Thank
you. Glenn.
Hey, Roger. Hello from Canada, everyone. Just a bit of witness here about how Arendt seems to me, because this inside-outside, two-world surface interior thing really fascinates me, Roger, especially recently. I spent a lot of time in the hospital in the last few months. I've had a couple open heart surgeries. I mean, I've actually seen through my skin to my actual heart. A machine did my breathing for me. And so this surface interior stage, behind the scenes thing is really with me. And it struck me that everything inside me is kind of the same as the other patients who I met at the hospital. The insides are not where my individuality is, in a way. Who I am is kind of on the surface, as weird as that kind of sounds. And I just wanted to testify to that and ask you if I'm on the right track here with thinking about my inner organs when I'm reading Arendt.
Oh, absolutely. First of all, I'm so glad you're out of the hospital and doing well, Glenn.
Thanks.
But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, Arendt talks about this in these pages. She talks about how, when you cut people open, their inner organs are generally largely the same and unappealing. And I'm just trying to figure out where remember.
Like we think about our heart as kind of defining us, but my heart's kind of the same as Gary, who was my roommate after surgery when we got out of ICU. We're kind of the same inside. Weird.
That's exactly right. And so she says, if you want to understand the plurality and uniqueness of a person, you can't privilege the inside, the cause, the behind the scenes. You actually have to pay attention also to the display of the self on the outside. And I think that's exactly right. I think it's
thanks to the VRG, Roger. It's been great with my recovery, gotta say.
Wonderful. It's great to have you here, Glenn. Dina, you'll get the last word today.
Thank you. I was wondering if we could return to Arendt's question on the bottom of page 30 in the critical edition, the question that we have been wrestling with for almost an hour and a half now, which is, you know, this silent and invisible nature of thought. And the question, the way that she phrases it at the bottom of 30 is, you know, whether thinking and other mental activities which are invisible and soundless are meant to appear to begin with, or whether they can never find an adequate home in the world.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that she may have answered the first part of the question. They in fact appear, maybe in a wordless way or in a silent way. They appear in the two-in-one, in that which she describes the dialogue we have with ourselves. But maybe the question is really, you know, about thinking's purposelessness and uselessness in the world,
Right.
rather than whether or not thinking doesn't make an appearance at all. Because, you know, the previous pages told us that there really is nothing but appearance. So, I mean, I don't think she'd have a hard time saying that thought makes an appearance, or is of a nature of appearing. It clearly appears.
You know, we're running out of time, so I'm just gonna jump in.
So I'm just wondering whether the real question isn't.
Yeah, no, I get it. I get
Yeah.
it. I think it's a great question. First of all, the two-in-one doesn't necessarily appear, right? I mean, that's actually one of the problems. To the extent that I talk to myself, it doesn't generally not visible to you. It's only visible to you when my talking to myself makes me refrain from doing things that everyone else is doing. And so that's what I was saying just now in response to Max, right? Which is that to some degree thinking appears in the world at those moments when we stop and think and pull ourselves out of the common sense and everyday. In so doing, thinking really only appears in times of crisis, Arendt says. And so, but this brings us to the question of you know, to what extent uh stopping and thinking, puzzlement is important. And I take her argument to be that there are more crises than we maybe recognize, and that we need more puzzlement and more thinking. And if there is a way in which, as you put it on the bottom of page 30, there's a way in which this invisible and soundless activity can find an adequate home in the world, it is going to be as a gadfly, as a stingray, as a manifestation of puzzlement that stings us and buzzes around us and upsets us and frustrates us in our everyday going along with the problems, and forces us to be puzzled and to maybe think for ourselves. That's the place. That's where she's going to aim to find an adequate home in the world for thinking. Okay. Wonderful. Really fun today. We'll keep reading for next week. I think, Yana, do you remember what we're reading for next week? Is it sections 4, 5, and 6?
Yes. Let me.
Is that right?
I have just 4 and 5.
I think it's just 4 and 5 because they're a little
5.
longer.
Yeah, that's
So for
perfect.
next week, we're reading sections 4 and 5. It's
I'll put it in the chat too.
and we'll put it in the chat. So thank you all very much. Enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and we'll see you next week. Thanks very much.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Roger.
Muchas gracias.
De nada. I will be in South America next month giving a bunch of lectures. If you're around, let me know.
Yes,
happy.
Professor Roger, I read your message, and first of all, congratulations. Second, it's time that, as I wrote you, that BRG comes closer to South America. Our experience is valuable and is missing in this BRG, but thanks God that you are coming. And it's time to say to Susan Overman, thank you for always taking into account South America. But please, Professor Roger, let us know if we can accompany you virtually.
Yeah, if there's a virtual aspect of it, we'll post it. I'm not sure if there is or not. I mean, I'm giving like 6 or 7 lectures. I'm not sure if any of them are going to be live streamed or not, but I will let you know if they are.
Okay, so if you know and you share the link, we'll be with you for sure.
All right. I hope so.
No, I promise.
Thanks so much, everybody. Bye,
Thank
Clara.
you. Thank you from
Bye-bye.
Canada.